Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. We are on day number 339 with the war with Gaza, 338 with the war with Lebanon, and 330 something with the rest of the Iranian proxies operating through that circle of fire that they created around Israel to attack and destroy. The latest updates from the different scenes or arenas of the fighting are very much similar to the days before. In Gaza, the IDF forces are continuing ready to strike at Hamas in all of its different forms, in all of its different bases, and yet they still keep on firing back. Just last night, we saw long-range weapons, rockets being fired from Gaza towards Israel's southern town of Ashkelon. Just to give you a little bit of an understanding, that's a city of about 120, 130,000 people suddenly rushing towards air raid, hearing air raid sirens and rushing towards their bomb shelters. That's something that we haven't seen for a while, and it's something which is a development that the IDF forces are obviously following. See exactly how rockets are still being fired from that northern area. Just in the last 24 hours, we've seen more details coming out of the tunnel in which the 6 hostages executed by Hamas just recently. And I say just recently because according to the latest information coming out, the hostages were executed about 10 days before their bodies were recovered by the IDF forces. IDF forces obviously were operating in that area and around that area, and the Hamas captors didn't wait. They executed the hostages in cold blood. From Lebanon, what we've seen in the last really week or so, Israeli a massive barrage of rockets being fired at Israel's north. We're probably talking about the most intensive rocket barrages that have been fired from Lebanon really since the start of the war with Lebanon, with the exception of that one day of the 31st of August, 1st of September, where we saw that Israeli strike, and then Hezbollah responding with hundreds of rockets on that day. In the south, the Houthis are continuing on with their aggression, still targeting the freedom of navigation through the Gulf of Aden and up through the Red Sea. And in Judea and Samaria, we've also seen dramatic events just in the last few days, a number of terrorist attacks being carried out. Just yesterday, 3 Israelis were murdered by a Jordanian who had come across the Allenby crossing from Jordan into Judea and Samaria, and they're carrying out an attack and killing 3 Israelis, as I said. Those are all being investigated as we go along to understand how those, really how that failure happened, how the Jordanians allowed a truck full of weapons and a terrorist to cross through the border crossing and to carry out his attack against the Israelis. Just literally an hour and a quarter before we started this broadcast, there was a dramatic scenes on Israel's road number 6. That's the road that goes from north to south in Israel, where Israeli security forces stopped a truck driving along also with Palestinians who had infiltrated into Israel from Judea and Samaria, one of them being arrested before he carried out his intent to carry out a suicide attack. That's where we're standing at the moment. But what we're going to discuss today is the subject of the complaint. Some people have said indictment. It's not the right word, indictment. The complaint that was just released by the US Department of Justice against the leaders of Hamas. Now, this is a complaint that was submitted already in February and was only now just released. I think the timing isn't coincidental. It comes with the murder of American hostages, and suddenly the US Department of Justice then releases this really quite damning document against Hamas for the public to see. I think that it's impossible to really disconnect between one incident to the other. To understand what exactly we're talking about, our guest today is Advocate Hank Kopel, a former federal prosecutor, an expert on counterterrorism, genocide prevention, and ideological conjugations, and the author of The War on Hate. Hank, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Maurice. It's a pleasure to be here. The subject matter, of course, is not a pleasure, but if we can help enlighten, my pleasure.
So that's the goal, Hank. What I'd like to do is, if I may ask, just walk us through a little bit through this document, what it is exactly. I mean, I've only been a prosecutor for 20 odd years in Israel. I headed a district prosecution for a few years. I've never seen a document of this nature. It's a little bit foreign to us non-US citizens and non-US lawyers. What exactly is this complaint, this proceeding that was initiated in February?
Well, you quite rightly hit on the critical, interesting fact about the format of the document, that it is not an indictment, although many press reports assumed it was an indictment and reported as such. It's a complaint. And I think we'll want to get into what that difference may signify in a moment. If you prefer, I'd be happy to sum up the nature of the charges and then get into the issue of the complaint, the format, and what it may signify.
Happily, thank you.
Sure. It contains 7 different counts. Each one, a count is the word in America for each crime that's alleged, or each incident of a crime that's alleged. It charges 6 Hamas leaders as the defendants in the incident. And as it sets forth in the complaint, it includes Ismail Haniyeh, who was the chair of the Hamas Politburo, Yahya Sinwar, who heads up Gaza's branch of Hamas, Mohammed al-Mashri, also known as Mohammed Dif, who is the commander of the Al-Qassam Brigades, the most forward-leaning terrorist faction of Hamas, committing its most violent acts. Marwan Issa, who's the deputy commander of the Al-Qassam Brigades underneath Mashri. And the last two, Khaled Mashal, who formerly was the deputy chief of the Hamas Politburo, and now has been head of the Hamas diaspora unit. And Ali Baraka, in a similar fashion, has been head of Hamas's national relations abroad. So the last two being more folks who coordinate Hamas's extra national activities and fundraising, etc. Those are the 7 people charged. Now, as of now, 3 of them are reported to have been killed: Haniyeh, Mashri, AKK, Al-Def, and Issa, but 3 of them remain alive by best public knowledge. The 7 counts are these under America's various counterterrorism and related statutes. The first 2 are for conspiracy to engage in material support of a designated foreign terrorist organization and conspiracy to provide material support for acts of terrorism resulting in death. Both of those counts have a maximum possible sentence of life in prison. They are not death penalty eligible. However, the next 3 counts, 3, 4, and 5, are actually eligible for the death penalty. The U.S. has not yet announced its position on that. It generally doesn't at this stage. Once the case is open and the defense is presented in court, the government then has to make the decision: are we seeking the death penalty or are we not? And we'll hear from that later if ever they are brought into court. These 3 counts are conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals, conspiracy to place a bomb intended that results in death of a U.S. national, and conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction that resulted in death of a U.S. national. Again, the reason the U.S. claims jurisdiction in all of these is because Hamas has killed not only a tragically also great number of Israelis and other foreign nationals, but also several U.S. citizens. And that's where they claim jurisdiction. All those 3 counts, which could result in death of a U.S. national and did so, are death penalty eligible. If not, it's generally a life in prison sentence if they're convicted. The last 2 are lesser penalized offenses. They're conspiracy to finance terrorism and conspiracy to violate U.S. regulations under the International Economic Powers Act. We abbreviate it as IEPA. And those are more regulatory offenses involving terrorist financing. The maximum sentence for those is 20 years. All 6 defendants, 3 of them remain alive today by best knowledge, are charged in all 7 counts. And that essentially is the nature of the charges. When you actually open the complaint, which is a 37-page document, from paragraphs 18 through 20-something, the details of the acts for which the charging are laid out. And to be honest, it's actually a massively complex set of allegations. They run for over 25 years of Hamas terrorism of various sorts, starting in the late 1990s and running right through to and including the horrible October 7th, 2023 massacres by Hamas, because all those incidents prior and including October 7th did result in the murder of several U.S. citizens. Basically, most of them abroad in Israel or in the territories. That's the essence of the facts and the charges of the complaint.
So what I did see, just as part of those details, just a few of really cherry picking from those alleged crimes. The park bombing in 2002 on the evening of the Passover festival, the Hebrew University bombing, which also took the life of 6 American citizens, and then jumping forward very quickly to 2014, the kidnapping and murder of the 3 teens in Gush Etzion, one of them being also an American citizen, jumping forward again to 2015 to the murder of the Henkin couple, also American citizens, and then jumping very quickly from there with other details, the Sbarro bombing also in 2002, 2001, sorry, in August 2001, where there were also a number of American victims. And really, it seems like really the focus was on very specific, maybe high-profile events, rather than going systematically through all of the U.S. victims. Is there a reason why they would include just some victims and not others?
That's an interesting question, and you're quite right that many of the factual allegations of the complaint, as you say, tend to draw from, incorporate, among others, some of the most notorious Hamas-generated attacks, bombings, as you said, the terrible Passover attack, Netanya, etc. I'm not certain as to why they did not list the names of the American victims, which is itself, you would expect that those things would be listed. I don't think it's a requirement in the complaint that they be listed, but one would more commonly expect that. But as always happens in American cases, the charging document is just a small piece of what's ultimately disclosed to the defense in the course of getting ready to try a case once the folks have been apprehended and brought before the court. There's a massive process of what we call discovery, which is the disclosure of the more specifics of the facts alleged in the complaint or the indictment. And so it's not out of the bounds of practice that you sometimes have a complaint or an indictment that lists incidents, and then the intricate details of the incidents are produced in disclosures given to the defense team many months before the trial. So I don't think there's necessarily something to be inferred from the names not being listed. Also, there's the fact that a complaint is more in the fashion of a preliminary document. And this is my greater concern about this being a complaint, which includes perhaps less listing of specifics, although it goes on 37 pages, a very comprehensive document. The concern is that a complaint leaves you in a lower state of readiness to proceed to actually try the case before a judge when it comes time to do that with a judge and a jury. Why is that the case? Because a complaint is not a document on which you can proceed to trial. What a complaint allows you to do is a statement of probable cause that these defendants are culpable in these acts, and therefore it suffices for you to obtain an arrest warrant from a judge. And one would only presume the U.S. has arrest warrants outstanding for these defendants, 3 of whom remain alive today. But when you go to court on a complaint, if, for instance, if the 3 remaining defendants alive are presented to a U.S. judge in New York where this is charged tomorrow, the United States has 30 days, and only 30 days, to convert this into an indictment before a presentation at a grand jury. And a grand jury presentation for simple cases can be done perhaps in a day or in a week, and you ask them to vote probable cause, they return the indictment, and then you've got the document on which you're allowed to keep the case before the court and proceed to trial several months or a year away. But this is an extraordinarily complex case, depending on transnational troves of evidence, witnesses, some of whom may be very hard to get before the court, etc. To bring this complaint into a presentation before a grand jury that will then vote on all these charges and all this evidence within 30 days is a Herculean task. To be honest, what perplexes me is the complaint was signed before a judge on February 1st, 2024, about 7 months ago. And that time period would have allowed the federal prosecution team to assemble all the evidence, the witnesses they would need to present before the grand jury. You don't have to present every witness for the grand jury. You can present summary testimony to a grand jury. But when you read this complaint and its intricate complexity of 25 plus years of the sophisticated terrorist organization's acts, which also relies in its facts on the fact that they're intricately related with Hezbollah, with the government of Iran, it's a hugely complex document, hugely complex story to tell to a grand jury. You would have expected the government would have had their team then go before the grand jury between February and now, come out with an indictment, which would be a sealed document, not yet public if they don't want to disclose it quite yet. They didn't do that over the intervening 7 months. They just let the complaint sit there. That just leaves you very under ready to proceed in court and start the process going toward indictment and trial and all that. So I think that makes you wonder what the Justice Department's ultimate intention was with this document. Are they really planning to be ready for trial, or are they looking at it as perhaps something of a lower priority?
I mean, that's what immediately struck me from reading the document. I was unfamiliar with this process of a complaint sealed in before a judge. It's something that we don't have here in Israel, and certainly we don't have in England where I studied. And then I read paragraph 17 of the complaint, which says exactly what you just described. This affidavit is being submitted for the limited purpose of establishing probable cause for the offences cited above. And I get the feeling that this was just the initial basis for asking for requesting arrest warrants against those potential suspects, not yet defendants. Is that the goal of this document?
Well, procedurally, the main function a complaint allows you to do is to get warrants issued by a court for your arrest, which then allows you to activate the law enforcement mechanisms to seek an arrest. And here, as I said, the problem is once you arrest a defendant and you now have a case before a court, there are a great many obligations on the part of the prosecution team that take vast amounts of time, effort, and intricate planning. And that is why at my 31 years as a prosecutor, I would rarely use the complaint unless we had some time-sensitive emergency. The critical function of complaint is you know a crime was committed, you have plenty of evidence in hand, although you may not have presented to a court yet. And there's a time-sensitive reason to seize an opportunity to arrest a defendant who you fear may flee, may escape to another jurisdiction. But right now, you've got them in your sort of target sites of, we know where he or she is, we can arrest them in the next few days, but we've got to get a document that allows us to get a warrant for the arrest. That's when you use a complaint. Especially this happens when you've just arrested somebody in the process of committing a crime. And you got to get them before a judge. You don't have time to spend a week or two before a grand jury. You got to get this person presented in court the next day. When you arrest somebody in America, you got to get them in front of a judge within 48 hours or you have to release them. That's why you do a complaint. But once you have the time to go before a grand jury, you do that. Because once you've presented someone in court, you've got to do all your disclosures. That's a massive operation. You got to start planning the scheduling of the witnesses and the evidence and preparing for trial. You really don't want to spend the next 2 months in a grand jury, diverting you from those pretrial preparation obligations. So the fact that DOJ issued this on February 1st under seal did not do anything to proceed to indictment. Unsealed it now raises questions. One significant fact is that this complaint was dated February 1st, 2024. There's another thing that the US government did on that same date. February 1st, 2024 was the date that the US publicly announced sanctions against several West Bank Israeli residents for alleged acts, improper acts or crimes against Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. I do not know and could only speculate as to the government's motivations. But when you see sanctions issued against one of your closest international allies' residents for alleged bad acts in a territory that's disputed globally, and on the same day, a complaint is prepared and sealed against that nation's adversary with whom they're at war, you've got to, but nothing is done to prepare the complaint to be ready for the courtroom presentations that will be coming if you arrest these folks. You got to wonder whether that complaint was primarily driven by a desire to launch a prosecution or to address certain diplomatic concerns that you're sanctioning Israel's residents in the West Bank. A lot of folks in America would object to that in the political process. You've got an election coming up. I have my concerns, given that nothing was done to bring this complaint to indictment in the succeeding months. It was just left sitting there. Here's another fact of great concern. The Wall Street Journal reported last week that Mashal, one of the living defendants, traveled from Qatar to Turkey, a NATO ally. And the Americans knew about this. They didn't do anything to seek to have him arrested in Turkey, one of our NATO allies. If you're seriously intending to prosecute these bloodthirsty, mass murdering terrorists, which you think would be a very high priority among the cases your National Justice Department prosecutes, you would ask a NATO ally to go into their system, as we do transnationally, and get this guy arrested and commence extradition proceedings from Turkey into America of this blood-curdling murderous terrorist. They didn't do anything.
I'll possibly add a few or a little bit of oil onto that fire. The complaint details the acts carried out by or the counts of the complaint against Yahya Sinwar, Marwan Isa, Muhammad Def, but there are entire sections in the complaint that refer to the Iranian direct involvement in those crimes, arming, funding, providing with weapons, providing with support of all kinds. And yet, shockingly missing from that indictment are any Iranian names, any Iranian defendants. Similarly, on the same note that you mentioned, many of the senior Hamas terrorists who operate in Turkey openly, freely, are similarly not mentioned in the complaint. There is a reference to Saleh Haruri, who was based in Turkey, moved to Lebanon, but there are dozens of other senior Hamas terrorists. Haruri has since been killed. He was killed the day before the complaint was put in, or 2 days before. And yet his replacement, Zahir Jabarin, who was in Turkey at the time, isn't mentioned at all in the complaint. It seems that there was very much an idea of cherry picking as to exactly who the suspects would be, the defendants would be. Ali Barakeh seems to be really the odd man out running around in Lebanon. But the others, Khalid Mashal, Ismail Hania, that at the time was running around in Qatar, Qatar isn't necessarily an official enemy of the United States. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily a friend, but there are very strong ties between the US and Qatar. Just a month previously to issuing the complaint, the US concluded a deal with Qatar to extend the lease on the biggest US military base in the Middle East, which is in Qatar. Really, the focus here seems to be, let's give a wider picture and talk about the Iranian involvement, but where we choose to do so, we will also take out the people who could possibly embarrass us because they are running around in the countries that we have very extensive relations with and NATO allies. And so we'll just tell a partial story. That's I think when you read the complaint with a bit of a wider perspective, I think that immediately jumps out when you hear descriptions in the complaint throughout Hamas's existence. The Iranian government, particularly the IRGC, was providing support to the terrorist groups. The relationship that played a significant role in Iran's global campaign for supporting terrorism. It's very strong statements, which were then not backed up by any suspect, any defendant, anyone responsible on the Iranian side. To me, it seemed like a glaring omission.
I think your inferences are consistent with the facts. I guess the concept would be things left undone, curiously undone, may help speak to the motives and intentions of the things that were done. On the point of Qatar, as you say, let's just say, I make no assumptions and make no criticisms of the prosecution team that worked in this case. As we all know, in large government organizations, I having been in the Justice Department as well, when the prosecution team sometimes has their mission and goals directed by supervisory folks higher up, whose responsibility is to say, what should we be doing here from a broader perspective? I understand that. And I'm sure that the prosecutors working on this complaint acted in complete good faith, saying these are really bad guys in a murderous way in the global arena. They have killed US citizens. They've declared their intention to do so and promised to continue to do so. This is a good thing to do. Fair enough. The problem is the broader context, as you point out. There are many entities and actors not listed in this complaint whom you would expect would be equal candidates for censure, prosecution, indictment, and incarceration at the very least, but we're not in there. And I think your point brings out something too, which has been a perhaps insufficiently addressed feature in the American discourse about the Middle East, which is a lot of the complaint focuses on 6 Hamas leaders, 3 who are no longer alive. It does not talk about their financiers, the head of the snake, Iran, in a way of charging those entities. It certainly acknowledges and relies as evidence to prove these people's culpability, their support from Iran, the joint declarations by Iranian leaders and these Hamas leaders that their goal is to destroy America and Israel, to destroy Israel, and America is a support of Israel to destroy it too, and to wantonly kill both their people's citizens. But the discourse in America, when you look at our public discourse, has focused more on Hamas. It really hasn't focused as much on Iran, which is behind all this, which is behind the ring of fire throughout the Middle East. And as I said, you had this complaint prepared and issued on the very same day that the American administration did something that's very unpopular with some sectors of the American populace, which is to bring sanctions against individuals in the West Bank who are Israeli citizens. I mean, it's so rare that America brings sanctions against non-high leaders of government or at large entities committing mass crimes and trouble around the world. To go after West Bank so-called settlers, they call it, for an action that may have been the wrong thing against a Palestinian neighbor, because I don't know the facts enough to speak to it, is highly unorthodox. They're not really done. And so why are they suddenly picking on these local Israelis in the West Bank in a way that they don't do with people around the world? The sanctions we generally bring are against major actors, terrorist organizations, folks trying to disrupt world trade and murder people, not some citizen of the West Bank. That happened on the same day. So you wonder if there's just a balance and say, look, we're going after Israel, our ally, but we go after Hamas too. See, we're okay. This fits within a broader context of an administration mindful that Iran is driving so much of this terrorism by its financing, by its arming, by its propaganda, by its normalization of heinous violence against Israel around the Middle East, its effort to disrupt the Abraham Accords and the looming potential Saudi-Israel rapprochement. This is so obvious in the public sphere. But nonetheless, when this administration came in 3.5 years ago, it stopped enforcing the sanctions that were up against Iran. And I'm sure you've seen this too, that the estimates are just by not enforcing still on the books oil sanctions against Iran, Iran's government has had over 100 billion in revenue it otherwise would not have had if those sanctions had been enforced in the ordinary course, if the administration had just kept on doing what was already happening before 2020. I heard an estimate a few days ago that Iran's GDP in 2020, 2021 was around a little under $200 billion. It's now estimated to be in the range of 400 to 450 billion was the figure I heard, which has much to do with our relieving of sanctions. This is consistent with bringing a complaint that only focuses on a select number of Hamas leaders, acknowledging the superior role of Iran behind all this and doing nothing to charge Iranian operatives who are well known out there. And I regret saying this, but this is administration, several of whose leading national security members were publicly opposed to the targeting and killing of the head of the ICRG, Qasem Soleimani, which was an extraordinary and effective blow against Iran's reign of terror around the Middle East. So I think when you add all those factors up, the fact that when one of the charged defendants recently traveled to Turkey, a NATO ally, and America, at least by the public record, did choose to sit on its hands and not seek his arrest, you really wonder if this complaint has more to do with showing that our administration hasn't given up on Israel. At the same time that they're sanctioning Israelis, they're pressuring Israel not to defeat Hamas and get rid of it, which must be done for security and safety, not just of Israelis, but also of Gazans. So I share that analysis that this complaint is of questionable motivation, even though it's a worthy thing to charge these people and prosecute them.
And incredibly, the complaint even on just following that on, the complaint even details Hamas's goals to destroy Israel. You have Ismail Haniyeh saying, well, the October 7 massacre was a blessed act carried out by heroes. And yet this doesn't seem to have influenced in any way, shape or form the American or the US administration's drive to force Israel into a deal with these genocidal terrorists. On the one hand, they say, well, these are genocidal terrorists looking to destroy you, supported by Iran, who are funding, arming, training you. But on the other hand, well, be nice and make friends with them, make a deal with them, as if Israel can really suffer that that fate of surrendering to the terrorists. So to what extent, Hank, do you think that this as a document represents the stance of the US administration? Is it separate? Because it doesn't seem to have influenced their policy or mindset in any way, shape or form. And to be honest, I reading it in the context and with everything else that's going on, it seems very much more like as you said, like a public relations venture rather than anything else. When you say that on the same day that it was issued, sanctions were imposed against Israelis for alleged acts that they carried out in Judah and Samaria. On the same day, they didn't ask for arrest warrants against Mahmoud Abbas for his well-documented, universally agreed pay-for-slay policy, where he pays hundreds of millions of dollars every single year as a reward for the same terrorists who murdered not only Israeli citizens, but who murdered American citizens. And yet he's absent entirely from this whole process. His culpability, the Palestinian Authority's culpability for these acts, that suddenly the US administration is entirely silent about. Is it possible that I don't know, possibly I'm judging too harshly and there's another sealed complaint against Mahmoud Abbas that will be released 5 minutes after he dies, or is that just a naivety?
I personally do not think you're judging too harshly when you articulate these compelling and disturbing facts. Again, as I always say, I don't know what's in the mind of President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken, or others. All I can do is look at what they do and what they choose not to do in the field of play, and then draw whatever inferences seem to accord with reality. You make a very good point about Mahmoud Abbas and the sanctions on the Palestinian Authority. So, as you well know, there is a law passed under the prior presidential administration by Congress and signed by President Trump called the Taylor Force Act. Taylor Force, being a U.S. West Point graduate who was murdered in Israel while I was there on study. That act says that aid to the Palestinian Authority and its entities will be suspended as long as the Palestinian Authority pays reward, pensions, and money to terrorists and the family of terrorists who murder Israelis, etc. In fact, it says that aid is conditional on the Palestinian Authority showing, they may not use the word good faith, but certainly good faith efforts to reduce the terrorism by its own people and citizens against Israelis. That is the literal opposite of what the Palestinian Authority has been doing since its inception under the Oslo Accords. We know that now from documentation. There never was a actual desire to make peace with Israel and have two states for two peoples from the day the Oslo Accords were signed. And I'm digressing a little, but folks who study the history would know that the very evening of the Oslo Accords ceremony in 1993 in the White House lawn, a tape was posted of Yasser Arafat on Jordanian television saying in Arabic, "Don't worry, folks, this wasn't real peace. We're not selling out. This is just a phase of our so-called plan of phases by which we acquire land, arm ourselves to the teeth, and then strike the killer blow against the colonialist state Israel." This is the night of the Oslo Accord signing. This is on Jordanian media. Folks who follow this, like Memory and other organizations, have translated this. So the thing that I focus on and responding to your thoughts on Abbas is, until President Biden was sworn in as president, the U.S. was enforcing the Taylor Force Act. They had cut aid, saying to Abbas and the Palace Authority, hey, as soon as you stop paying and rewarding terrorists for mass murdering Israelis, as soon as you stop indoctrinating your people en masse to emulate terrorist killers of Jews as the highest calling a Palestinian Arab could do in this life, you will have aid, you'll have support, will help you develop a flourishing society. But until then, no, that's American law. That law has not been changed. That law is still in the books. But the Biden administration soon reopened the money spigot to the Palestinian Authority despite its shameful non-compliance with these utterly reasonable and civilized demands. And we know, another thing I've talked about with people here in the States is, little known to many Americans, the figures I saw from Israel within the year preceding the October 7th attacks down from Hamas in Gaza, on the West, emanating from the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, were approximately 3,000 attempted terror attacks in the past year. It was like a record high by Palestinian terror. There already was a Palestinian Authority terror war against Israel, live and ongoing at the time of the October 7th attacks. So when you have an administration that is doing a policy that can only be characterized as an appeasement policy a la 1938 toward the Palestinian Authority, toward Iran with the relaxing of sanctions, and you look at this complaint, which selects out a few Hamas leaders, truly terrible leaders, but leaves a lot unsaid and undone, you have to wonder how much this is public relations from the highest levels as opposed to a sincere desire to prosecute these people to the max, which would have been doing things like getting Turkey to arrest that defendant a week ago when he showed up there instead of sitting on our hands. It is highly problematic. And I'm going to tell you, I regret saying this terribly. I'm a 31-year veteran of the U.S. Justice Department. It's a noble institution. Over the centuries of this country's existence, it's done great things to protect its people and to protect the cause of safety here and around the world. But I think this is really problematic.
I have to say that at one stage in my career as the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, I had a conversation with someone. I won't say exactly who, but the conversation was something in the regions of, well, what would you prefer? Would you prefer that Israel arrest and prosecute the terrorists for murdering American citizens as well as US Israeli citizens, or would you prefer that the Department of Justice initiate these proceedings and those people be extradited to America and to seek justice? My answer was very, very clear that obviously we would prefer Israel as a sovereign country to prosecute the terrorists in our jurisdiction to the full extent of our law. But there are instances where we would possibly consider alternatives. Take, for example, the case of Ahlam Tamimi. Ahlam Tamimi, who chose the site of the Sbarro murder, the Sbarro massacre. That was a suicide bombing in 2001, murdering 15 people. She was the one who chose the site. She then led the terrorist from Ramallah into Jerusalem and really pushed him through the front door of the pizza shop to blow himself up. She was released as part of the Shalit deal in 2011. She's now running around freely in Jordan. She has her own television program. And I responded that maybe in cases like that, the US could do more to really take authority, especially with Jordan, who there are even tighter relations than with Qatar. And indeed, there is a complaint against Ahlam Tamimi. There's even a request for extradition, which the Jordanians have just rejected outright, as if they can flout those types of agreements. And so really, it doesn't say much for I won't say the bona fides about the teeth of the American justice system to bring these terrorists to justice. It seems that possibly there is goodwill and good intentions, but really very little ability to actually realize those intentions. And a lot is being done and said in order to paint a picture of, look what we're trying to do, but really in the knowledge that they don't really want to do anything.
I think that is sadly correct. At least, as a former prosecutor yourself as well, you look at the facts, you draw the inferences, which most closely accord with one's common understandings of human nature and human social organization. And the facts here shout out pretty loud that, unfortunately, it seems that the United States government, at least in the present administration, is taking a broader tack, more of appeasement and negotiation than of deterrence. I recently published a piece in Jewish News Service about America's foregone deterrence. And it's interesting because, and I realize this is straying a bit from the issue, but I think it's illustrative of the broader context in which we face these tragedies. You see on the streets of America, and again, because we have our own domestic issues like every nation does, including ethnic rivalries, racial issues, things on our history we wish hadn't done, but were done, that we try to correct for. But the things in America on our streets since the killing of George Floyd in the hands of the police and similar actions that have been very controversial, understandably, has led to a defunding and defanging of our own domestic law enforcement. The rates of mass thefts in stores that keep neighborhoods vibrant has gone way up. The homicide rates, the violent crime rates are up. I've seen one estimate by a careful data-oriented professor, between 1,000 and 6,000 Black Americans have been killed in the streets of our cities because of relaxed law enforcement. Ironically, law enforcement relaxed purportedly in the name of our minority communities that have had a bad deal in past decades, right? We see a loss of deterrence domestically. We're seeing it internationally. Once we lifted the sanctions enforcement against Iran 3.5 years ago, the ring of fire has exploded. We have seen this in Ukraine, where the American president said, as Putin massed troops on the Ukrainian border, well, if it's a small incursion, that might not be a problem. Literally, an American president said this a month before Putin launched his horrific war to destroy Ukraine. There is a failure to recognize that deterrence always must be maintained. And oftentimes, societies like America that live in relative peace and security with our oceanfront borders and our relatively peaceful neighbors, we lose the thread. Israel doesn't have that luxury. Israel knows what it's like to be surrounded by enemies. And I say this with sadness as a very patriotic American and Zionist both, who loves both countries deeply, that America has been letting down Israel, but not just Israel. It's letting down the cause of security and peace and flourishing for the peoples of the Middle East by its enablement of bad actors like Iran and Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. You are spot on in my view. I think all this is correctable, but the tragedy is how many people have to suffer, how many people have to be killed, how many people have to be maimed and wounded because of the failures of our recognition of the importance of deterrence globally. That's a big
understanding really the nature of these genocidal terrorists. I try to end the briefings, Hank, on a positive note. Is there something positive that you can say going forward as to what you think this could possibly bring about? Maybe a realization for the next administration that this is something that a practice that needs to be changed, recognizing some people complain that there's a difference between the factual situation and the legal situation. Here, the two are very, very, very much connected. The facts are very clear. These are genocidal terrorists. The legal situation is very, very clear. They should be prosecuted and brought to justice at best. And yet there still seems to be that disconnect. Do you think that that's something that will change going forward with the Harris administration or the Trump administration?
I have my goal here is not to be partisan and not to be ad hominem in any way. But the first, I make a couple of observations, and the first one is a general one. I do not believe that the present American policies of appeasement and negotiation, I'm sure those carrying out would not call them appeasement. They probably call them something like realism, etc. But they are policies that I believe more manifest a level of appeasement in the face of truly genocidal adversaries. Those policies, I believe, do not reflect the center line of where the American voting public is at. I think most Americans, even if they're not deeply informed about the Middle East, they get it, that groups like Hamas can never be appeased, can never be successfully negotiated with, and that, as great historians of military history say, the best guarantee of peace is a publicly decisive defeat of genocidal and mass homicidal enemies. This is well proved statistically in military history. Ambiguous peaces lead to ambiguous results and more harm and war and fighting. I think the vast majority of Americans understand that's not the way to go. How that plays out electorally, I don't know. I just published a piece in Times of Israel actually challenging the former general counsel of the World Jewish Congress, Melvin Rosensaft, who wrote a very strong endorsement of Ms. Harris's policy advisors and how that bodes for the Jewish community worldwide and in the Middle East. I dissented from that. I think her advisory team is very problematic. Ilan Goldenberg and I forgot his first name, Mr. Gordon, her likely national security advisors, they are following the appeasement line. They oppose the killing of Soleimani. They oppose sanctions. They called out for the reducing of sanctions on Iran in their prior incarnations. It's a very problematic team. So I'm not optimistic that the Harris administration understands what we've been talking about, the need for deterrence, the need for decisive action against terrorist genocidal groups. And let me just add, what they also don't appreciate in their public comments is the statistically demonstrated reality that no nation in all human history, including America and Great Britain, have done more to protect civilian lives on the adversary side of the line than Israel. What Israel has done is extraordinary. I say this without, I believe, political bias. The world should be thanking Israel for setting the example of how to fight a war in the least damaging way humanly possible, which is what it's done and is doing. I don't think the Harris administration understands that. I've recent statements by Vice President candidate Waltz and by Harris, where they say they have to defeat Hamas, but they can't do it this way. It shows a misunderstanding of geopolitics, the nature of the Middle East, the lion's den on which that surrounds Israel. I do think the Trump administration, mindful that there are many critiques one can bring as to some of the rhetoric, and I know this is very controversial, but the Trump administration's leading policymakers on the Middle East, like David Friedman, the ambassador, and others, I think they show a wisdom about deterrence, a wisdom about how the Middle East actually works, a wisdom about the world outside the relatively peaceful and protected United States works that is lacking on the other side of the aisle. I think if they are there, they are likely to be much more proactive vis-a-vis the Iranian threat. One can expect them to reimpose the sanctions at law against the Palestinian Authority under the Taylor Force Act. They will maintain the ban on funding UNRWA, which, as we know, and I've done a report for the NGO I work with, that UNRWA is basically a branch of Hamas under the fig leaf of the United Nations. They understand that. They will affect policies in that direction. It's my belief that if administration were in, they would deal with those things in a way that would probably bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, and you'd see a real sea change. What they would do about Iran, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But Iran needs to be defanged in some way for the Middle East to have an opportunity of broader peace. But I think that administration is likely to act in that direction if elected. I'm hopeful more than anything that the American people and the Israeli populace understand these things. It's my hope that leaders on the American side can come to these recognitions.
And so I will possibly be a little bit more controversial than you, Hank. for our finishing note, and say that I wish and the remaining three terrorists, Sinwar, Mashal, and Barakeh, the same fate as the US decision regarding Osama bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Those three should find the same form of justice and never see the inside of a courtroom. I think that is the only way that we can necessarily bring about the rightful justice for their acts. Hank, unfortunately, our time has come to an end. Thank you very, very much for joining us and for explaining really the complexities and intricacies of the complaint. For our audience, we will be back with you again on Wednesday. In the meantime, everyone, please do keep safe.